From the studios of KENW on the campus of Eastern New Mexico University, it's You Should Know, featuring the people and events of Eastern New Mexico and West Texas.
Welcome back to You Should Know. Today, I'm your host, Desirée Markham, joined by two amazing guests, Dr. Jeff Gentry and Dr. Jayson Evaniuck. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
It's great to be here.
Good to be here.
So we're here to talk about fatalities related to time zones. Tell our audience a little bit about that, or explain what's that relationship, or how did you come to seek out a relationship between these two topics?
Right. It begins with the theories of chronobiology, which, interestingly enough, about 3 years ago, I read an article in a newspaper because this research study by these two Italian economists just caught fire about how time zone boundaries might influence health.
Okay.
And so then I brought in Dr. Evaniuck because I wanted to do a geographic study on another variable besides, say, cancer. And the problem is that we have these circadian rhythms
Right.
that affect our health and well-being. And so it just occurred to me that what about driver acuity? Can a person's ability to drive be affected by our circadian rhythms? And anyway, many regions in the United States are stuck in bad time zones where the natural time zone boundary is not observed. And so folks in West Texas, for example, are on Central Time when they absolutely should be in our time zone in New Mexico. And so they have to get up before dawn. Anyway, when I read this study about health, I thought, well, is there another dependent variable or another impact that time zones might have? And so a really easy one to think of was car accidents.
Right.
So I don't want to tell a long story, but I've always been concerned about driving and accidents, and wondered when I moved to New Mexico, why is it that it's so easy for me to wake up in the morning? Well, it's because we're in the right time zone.
Okay. Well, that's comforting to know that we're in the right time zone. So does that mean that then there's lower traffic fatalities here?
There is.
Okay.
And I guess to kind of back up just a little bit in terms of, well, viewers might be thinking, well, what's right and what's wrong about time
Right.
zones? So if you can imagine, our globe is our world, 360 degrees, right, for a circle or a circular object, and 24 hours in a day. So if you do the math, we should have a time zone every 15 degrees of longitude.
That makes sense.
That's kind of the idea. So if everything is in a perfect world and our time zones are following that, what we deem natural or solar pattern, every 15 degrees we get a new time zone. That's not really how it shakes out, because the time zones were actually political decisions.
Okay.
And, the railroads in America particularly had a heavy hand in the way these time zones were drawn. They weren't necessary. Generally they stayed with the 15 degrees, but there would be aberrations.
Right.
And the places where there are aberrations are the places that we really took a look at.
Okay.
What we called the eccentric time locations. And fortunately for us in New Mexico, we're right where we should be. And in terms of when the sun comes up, it's consistent with the actual time.
Okay.
So
what would be appealing? So given y'all's individual backgrounds, your education, you're both PhDs. So PhD in tell our audience.
Communication.
Okay.
And Dr. Evaniuck's EDD in
education.
Right. Well, I was
Okay.
going to say that.
Curriculum and instruction.
Okay, specifically
Okay.
that.
All right.
Yeah.
So how does that connection come? Like, what particularly, you said you had read about the economist who had done this one study.
Right.
So what was the draw for y'all, given your subject matter backgrounds, to this topic?
Right. And that's a great question, because it isn't often that those of us in the fine arts, the humanities, and social sciences get to do hard science.
Right.
Because that's exactly what this is. We have the big data. And although death rates vary in particular localities, and our particular part of New Mexico isn't great on death rates, but when you look at the big data, the correlations are very clear. And so those eccentric time localities nationally have a 21% 5.8% higher death rate than the solar or natural zones.
That's huge.
So anyway, so my approach to it is, I'm a kind of a geography nut, although I don't have a master's in geography like Dr. Evaniuck. And to me, looking at these time zones, it's clear, and you can understand this, the fact that these political divisions that were made, that Jayson identified very nicely, time zones are rhetorical.
Right.
And so as a communication person, I want to look at these artificial time zones as a rhetorical choice or a political choice. And so that's the orientation that I come from. And so I naturally sought Dr. Evaniuck, as well as a couple of biologists, Ivana Mali, formerly of ENMU and now at NC State, and her student, MJ Suryamonkol, who is now a PhD student at Southern Illinois. So that's my orientation and why I brought in Dr. Evaniuck.
Yeah, and I think an important component to this research is oftentimes when scholarly research is done, it's kind of like I think of Plato's cave, and you have all these voices bouncing around in the cave, and,
Exactly.
and it never really gets out of the cave.
Yeah.
This one's a little unique in that, and I attribute this to your expertise of being able to get this, and the fact that we're doing this show is a perfect example, but to get these conversations out of just the chronobiology community, I think. And I'm thinking of the correspondence we had with a Russian chronobiologist who said just this. He says, this is the type of work that has the ability to get out of our cave, if you will, that we're in. And we need more of this happening. Because generally the chronobiologists, which neither of us are chronobiologists, but they just have these conversations with each other. And I think this study has the potential to not only communicate in that community, but also to reach out.
Right. Yeah. So that's a huge so what factor, because this is huge. This is traffic fatalities.
Right.
And because you have so many different experts from different fields participating in this, and then now the media attention on it, that's a little bit unusual, especially for higher education and the world of academia, right?
Yeah.
So how do you see this going as far as, like, are there next steps? Will there be another study? Or is there a particular entity's attention that you're hoping to get? I mean, are we going to end up redrawing our time zones? Or what does this ultimately look like, ideally?
I mean, that would be the radical approach. And that has, implications that have to be considered. I mean, it would be easy to say, well, just redraw. But obviously, these are policy discussions that need to happen. There's costs and benefits of such decisions that entities need to take very seriously. So we don't minimize that, but I certainly think it's worth having those conversations. But I think at the practical level, you pointed out some of the, and I'll let you speak to that.
The policy implications. Yeah. Right, yeah. Unlike the previous study that got our interest, which didn't talk about the policy implications, we do. And so one, it refers to daylight saving time. Right now in the New Mexico legislature, there are two competing bills with the same name, one that would make daylight saving time permanent year-round, and the other that would eliminate daylight saving time. And so that's kind of what's significant for us right now, because daylight saving time is another element that creates circadian deficits by a full hour for almost 8 months out of the year. So the state of Arizona and the entire nation of Mexico have eliminated daylight saving time. And so that is a clear implication. Europe, there are European scholars who are interested in our research because they're trying to create more natural time zones in Europe and eliminate daylight saving time. There's an entire national organization called Save Standard Time that is trying to get rid of daylight saving time in this country, and then an international alliance for natural time that is trying to do the same thing. So, time zones are rhetorical. So we don't necessarily want to argue a position today, but that is important. And we are interested in further research on, do bad time zones create other health and wellness and other issues, such as education?
Okay. So When it comes to, you were mentioning like the hard sciences, right? And like taking this big data and how exciting for people in our field, because I also come from that communication background, to be able to look at that. And with that hard data and those hard facts, of course, all these things you're talking about are man-made, the time zones themselves, even time, I suppose, is man-made if we get philosophical about it, right? So in looking at those impacts on the health aspects of everything, that would be something that you could measure in terms of like what cancer risk or diseases, or what would that kind of look like, that circadian rhythm tied
Yeah,
to
I
that?
didn't even tell you what the previous research said. So chronobiologists are interested in the health effects of time. And time is a real thing, according to biology, because of these circadian rhythms. In other words, chronobiology is the science of 24-hour physiological processes.
Okay.
So chronobiologists, as well as neurologists, because Save Standard Time is the organization that has several neurologists on board, including Dr. Karen Johnson in Springfield, Massachusetts, who is very interested in our research. And they are very upset at unnatural time, which does cause higher rates of cancer if people have this social jet lag from shift work or bad time zones or daylight saving time. But cancer, stroke, diabetes, obesity, and dementia have all been linked to these circadian deficits that we're concerned about.
Wow. So this could have huge impacts across the board, not just the traffic fatalities.
We're just one part of that. This is the newest discovery.
Yeah, and I would say, we don't add anything in terms of the health. The health sciences have already explored these and found this to be, happening within the research. What I would say our contribution to the conversation is to really zero in on these eccentric time locations. We've actually developed a way to determine, is this an eccentric time location or is it not? And we've kind of zeroed in on that. So I think our sort of unique contribution to the research is that aspect of it. And I think, that I would like to see that extended, to other areas as well.
Right. The previous research has mainly been on daylight saving time.
Okay.
And so we're identifying that DST is not the only insult to natural circadian rhythms and natural time. So yeah, we provided that framework that future research could do. So when we get other full data sets in terms of health, we would like to plug that into our system, which is an improvement, I think, over the Italian system that just looks at time zone boundaries. Some of those boundaries are pretty good. Others are very eccentric. And so ours provides a system to determine that.
And we mentioned the term big data, I guess, to clarify what our big data is. Pretty much every fatality in the United States from 2006 to 2017 is what our data was. So we basically what we would call a census data of every single episode. It was not a random sample. Every single fatality was explored. And, so when Dr. Gentry talks about it being 21% higher, it's not based on the random sample. It's based on every single fatality in comparing eccentric time locations such as West Texas with, natural time zones such as us.
So speaking of Texas, that one falls in the eccentric category, right?
2/3 of Texas.
Okay. And so that's bad or negative in what way? What does that impact look like?
The results are scary.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about Midland, Odessa versus El Paso?
Yeah. So, you can kind of get a little bit of a case study within Texas because El Paso is the only part of the state that's actually in the Mountain Time Zone.
Correct.
And Midland, Odessa, which is not too far, relatively speaking, in Texas terms, it's not too far, has a 56% higher.
Well, it's 3 times worse than El Paso.
Okay.
Ridiculously so. Right. And then Amarillo is 85% above the national average. Midland, Odessa is double the national average and 3 times worse than El Paso. So, and then Terre Haute, Indiana is in an eccentric time zone location, and their vehicle fatality rate is 53% higher than nearby Terre Haute, Indiana, which, nearby Champaign, Illinois. Terre Haute is worse than Champaign by 53%. These are, cherry-picked examples,
Right.
but in the total scheme of things, these are not estimates. These are actual death rates at more than 21% higher in those zones.
And an element that we did include in the analysis, because one might be thinking, well, are you comparing a rural country road driving to urban city? And we did account for that. So we utilized the census designations of an urban metropolitan area and make sure we're comparing apples with apples and rural with rural. And there's actually a category called micropolitan, which is kind of that spot in the middle. And we compared those census designations with each other so that we weren't, so that we had an accurate and more accurate and fair comparison.
So then when we look at that and looking at the accuracy of it, is there a way, so a very academic term, so hopefully our audience will forgive me, but the variable isolation and being able to determine, okay, the correlation is this. Is there any other outstanding variable that was or was not accounted for, particularly in Amarillo or the Midland Odessa area, that people might say, well, so we've discussed, urban kind of versus metro, but is there anything else going on in either of those two places that would make people bad drivers?
The reason we use those examples is that they're similar sized communities, relatively speaking. They're both metro, right? Champaign and Terre Haute are both metro. Midland, Odessa, and El Paso are both metro. But we found in both urban and rural areas, the difference between the eccentric time localities and the natural time zones was marked. The pattern was very consistent. The lucky part of our country is the West Coast, because the Pacific time zone has no eccentric time localities, and they happen to have the safest roads in the country. Those ETLs that we talk about that are in the Eastern, Central, and Mountain time zones are more than 50% above the Pacific coast. Those states on the West Coast that observe Pacific time.
Wow.
So that's why we say, we use these examples, and we understand that highway fatalities are a very complex, dynamic kind of thing.
Right.
You can't say that the bad time zone caused this accident. But when we look at the big picture, the pattern is very consistent.
So ideally, for a day or a day in the life of any particular individual in, say, a good time zone, like we fall into in New Mexico, you wake up at what time and where is the sun? You go to work at what time, drive home? What does that kind of ideal day look like, since we are aligned correctly here?
Well, and ideally, we should be waking up kind of with the sun. That idea of the sun's up, you wake up, and that should be our natural alarm clock, so to speak. And as the sun goes down, we should also be not necessarily going to bed when the sun goes down, but into that sort of wind down mode. And this gets interesting, because then that would mean, at least in the farther away you get from the equator like us, and even more pronounced up north, this creates, if you're truly following the sun, then you sleep more in the winter and less in the summer. And obviously we still live life normal. We can't purely follow the sun in that way. But what I do find interesting, if you look at the Middle Ages prior to the clock, people's habits and patterns generally followed the sun. So there really is something that I think the ancients, if you will, understood that we've lost in bringing the clock. And I'm not in any way saying we get rid of the clock. But the more that we can make those adjustments to where we are more aligned with the sun, the better. So alarm clocks, that's another, it's
and electric lights.
I mean, sometimes we have to have them, but the more that we can, limit things like alarm clocks in our life by adjusting our sleep habits and patterns, I think the better off we are. So those are, I think, some practical dimensions to that sort of question.
Well, and with that circadian rhythm, from what I've read from y'all's piece, that's something that if you do that habitually, you'll fall into that naturally as a person, right? And then you don't even need an alarm clock. If we literally woke at the same time every day and went to sleep at the same time, our bodies would become very accustomed to that and do that naturally.
Right. Yeah. Neurologists don't like alarm clocks. And if you live in Amarillo or Lubbock, which also has a high rate of fatalities, it's really impossible to go without an alarm clock. In New Mexico, it's a lot easier. Neurologists say that if we can just get 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night, that's enough. But it also matters when those hours occur in relation to the sun. And so here, it's not hard to get to work at 8 o'clock. And as long as we're not using media too much or have lights on too late and not get our 7 to 9 hours, we're in a good spot. In West Texas, in parts of the 3 time zones besides Pacific, it's very hard, and our bodies suffer for it.
Right, right. What has been maybe the most surprising or shocking part of this research for both of you? If it were different or the same for each of you individual, what has been the most surprising or shocking that you maybe didn't expect to find or come across once you took the big data, and you looked at all of it? So that's very comprehensive from the timeline that you chose.
Well, to me, I mean, we started with the hypothesis that, we, based on the previous research and based on chronobiology theory, we think that there could be something here. And we found there was. Well, what's interesting is you'd think, well, that's not shocking. But when you actually boil it down and look at the percentage rates, and again, we can't account for why those fatalities occurred. Each situation has its own
Right.
variables. We're not at all suggesting that it is the root cause for every single fatality on the roads. But when you look at the census, the entirety of the data, and you see the numbers, even though that was your theory or your hypothesis based on theory, it's still shocking.
Okay.
Yeah, the sheer magnitude of difference in the big picture is, this could have been a nothing burger, because we did everything in the right order. We theorized, we looked at previous research. It would be consistent with previous research in chronobiology if the death rates were higher. The fact that they were 21% higher is kind of mind-boggling. I mean, that is a large amount of difference. And the fact that it's not based on extrapolations from a sample makes it more shocking. I mean, we use the word shocking in the academic paper itself.
Right.
Because, we could have found nothing. And the size of the difference really is remarkable.
So that 21%, so for our viewers who don't know what would be considered significant in academic research,
right?
How does that compare to what's actually considered significant?
Good. Right. And see, the thing is, when we have full population data or census data, we don't have to talk in those terms, right? If it were a sample, we would say, okay, is P less than 0.05, and what's the effect size? We have the data. That's what they say, 21% higher, which even in science, that's major.
Right.
So instead of statistical significance, we talk about practical significance, such as we estimate, based on just very conservative normal amounts of economic cost per highway fatality, that these unexpected deaths, these excess deaths in the eccentric time zones, add up to $1.8 billion in lost economics per year. Okay, and then on the human side, the average vehicle fatality costs 38 years of life lost. So unlike cancer or diabetes, that on average people are going to be a little older, the average person who dies in a car accident is only about 40 years old.
Gentlemen, this is amazing research. I'm so glad that you are investigating this topic. And the next steps, we talked about the radical implications this could have, but what is the practical next step for the two of you?
Well, I think we are interested in extending it out, really using trying to stick with the methodology and the framework that we have developed, but we would like to take a look at educational outcomes.
Okay.
That's a little more complicated though, because each state does their own sort of thing in terms of educational outcomes. And then of course, standardized testing in and of itself
Right.
poses many issues. So that we have some ideas on how we can explore that. And that's
Okay.
kind of one of our next steps.
Well,
So,
best of luck to both of you. So I look forward to having you back on another episode with new discoveries and implications of misaligned time zones. So thank you. And thank you to our audience of You Should Know. I've been your host, Desirée Markham, joined by Dr. Jayson Evaniuck and Dr. Jeff Gentry, talking about misaligned time zones. Be sure to tune in next time to You Should Know.